This is Greater LA on KCRW, the show that connects you to the people and places of Southern California. Hey there, I'm Steve Chiatakis.
To my team, my supporters, and the thousands of volunteers, and to all of those who voted for me, I am so grateful that you believed in me and that you believed in this movement. I promise you I will not let you down.
That's Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon claiming victory last year over an incumbent that a majority of voters didn't want to stay. And he came into the office with some big progressive plans: criminal justice reform, an end to excessive tough-on-crime policies, fighting crime but with more mercy, less jailing. 3 months later, after Gascon followed through on many of those reforms, he now faces major pushback from some voters and even his own employees. A recall campaign is in the works, and the union representing the county deputy DAs is taking Gascon to court with a hearing on the matter scheduled for tomorrow. Joining me right now is LA County District Attorney George Gascon. Mr. District Attorney, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I guess the question for you is, how are you doing? You're about 2 months into your tenure at the DA's office. How's it going?
You know what? It's going well. It is going well. Change is never easy, and this was something that I and many others anticipated that it was going to happen. But, we've started fulfilling many of the campaign promises. We've ended the death penalty. We are moving to a more clinical and trauma-informed services for our victims. We're treating children like children again. We're ending and seeking unfair enhancements such as 3 strikes and gang enhancement, which has created massive incarceration in this country. We're advancing public safety through equity. We're using data and science and objective facts in order to make our decisions. So we're moving in a different, and I believe a more thoughtful, and eventually a direction that will provide greater safety for our community. But as I said, change never comes easy, and there are people that have been stuck in the mass incarceration, tough on crime for the last 4 decades, and they're fighting back.
Well, let's talk about that pushback that you refer to. The union representing LA County Deputy District Attorney says what you're doing violates California's 3 strikes law. This is the union saying that it requires prosecutors to seek longer sentences for defendants with prior convictions. The union's vice president, whom we're going to hear from in just a few minutes, said in a recent NPR interview that, quote, just because Mr. Gascon, as the elected DA, feels that certain laws are bad policy, it doesn't authorize him to violate the law or even authorize directing his prosecutors to also violate the law. What do you say to that?
Look, I mean, there are several points. Number one, it is clear that the law gives wide berth and a great deal of discretion to especially the elected prosecutor. The reality is that many of these strikes and many of these enhancements have never been uniformly applied, meaning that, prosecutors in this office, as well as other offices around the state, often pick and choose when they're going to use this. It's not an issue of the legality of it. It's an issue of discretion. And unfortunately, this is a union that spent a lot of money campaigning against me. They did not want reform to come through. And they're now fighting reform. Reform is here. Basically, they're relitigating the election through the courts, and that's fine. We'll go through the court process. I think that the other part that I find amazing is that the people, over 2 million people in LA County voted for me, and they voted for me based on the policies that I promised that I was going to implement, which I am implementing. And to have, a system where you have individual prosecutors determining when they are going to enforce, what laws they're going to enforce, is not what the people voted for.
It's not just the union or the employees in the office, though. Several DAs in other counties throughout the state have spoken out as well in opposition. The district attorney in San Diego said your treatment of victims was cruel. After your sentencing restrictions limited the penalties the accused could face on a brutal robbery and double murder case. I mean, what do you say to the criticism, though, that you're more focused on the rights of defendants than the rights of crime victims?
It's obscene. First of all, I am very committed not only to today's victims, but I am committed to tomorrow's victims. The reality is that the system that we've had in place has created recidivism rates in upwards of 70%. And that means that people continue to reoffend and they continue to victimize people. But let's look at the case of the San Diego case, because that's a very illustrative case. That is a case where the individual is facing 68 years in prison. And the San Diego district attorney somehow felt that 68 years is not enough. She wanted to see more. Clearly, this individual will probably die in prison with a 68 years. So whether she adds another 30 years to the table, it's meaningless. What it isn't meaningless is the fact that she will be spending thousands and thousands of dollars, San Diego taxpayers, in order to make a political point. We have an issue, much like we have at the national level. We have some elected DAs around the state that have been very, very embedded in the tough on crime and the mass incarceration years, and they're refusing to let go. They're increasingly losing influence, and unfortunately, they are fighting, and we're going to fight back.
How did we get here in the first place? I mean, how did things, the three strikes law, the tough crime bills, things like that? How did that happen?
In the late 1970s, California as well as the United States, we were on par in our incarceration rates with most of the industrialized democracies around the world. By the 1990, we went from about 23,000 people in prison in 1980 to about 95, 96,000 by 1990. In 1994, we passed three strikes, and by 1999, we had 160,000 people in prison. This has been a process of about 4 decades that we started basically with a war on our own communities, a war on Black people, a war on poor people. We created a whole industry around incarceration and tough on crime. We built 22 prisons in California during a period of time where we built one public university. We defunded education. We defunded public health. We defunded public housing in the last 40 years, and we're paying the price of that. And there are political and money interests tied to the past.
I wonder, though, Mr. District Attorney, how do you push through these reforms, though? Because it is what you say you were elected on. 2 million people voted for you in L.A. County. How do you push through those reforms with so much resistance in your own office?
Well, I mean, let's also begin by, saying that there are a lot of people in the office that are supporting me. And so the union did not take a vote when they decided to move forward with this lawsuit. The executive board did it on their own. I can tell you that I have many, many women and men in the office that are reaching out to me, and they're upset about what their union is doing, and they are supportive of the direction that we're going. Having said that, the reality is that we have a core group of people in law enforcement, that includes district attorneys, that are very wedded to the mass incarceration years, which, by the way, all the data shows that created greater insecurity. But like anything else, change is hard to come. And for some people, it will be very hard. Other people will adapt, and other people are embracing it very quickly.
Are you prepared? Are you prepared for a recall campaign?
Oh, absolutely. Listen, I think if it qualifies, which they may, I believe that we'll prevail again. The majority of the people in LA County are not prepared to go back to the bad old days. And I say we because this is not about me. This is about the future of our community.
George Gascon, LA County's District Attorney. Mr. DA, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, Steve. You take care of yourself.
Well, let's talk about the pushback from the union representing LA's deputy district attorneys. They are suing Gascon over getting rid of many of those sentencing enhancements. The first hearing, by the way, regarding that suit is scheduled for tomorrow. Eric Siddall is the vice president of that union. This is the Los Angeles Association of Deputy District Attorneys, and he's with us right now. Mr. Siddall, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us about this lawsuit. I mean, what grounds do you and the other DAs have for filing it in the first place?
Well, the issue is really about following the law. An elected DA has wide discretion in determining what type of charges to pursue in individual cases. But the law actually limits the district attorney on certain types of charges. The most obvious one is under California three strikes law, which requires a DA to plead up and prove the prior record of a defendant if the felony is a serious or violent felony. So what we're asking basically is that the DA follow the law, that while we recognize, and I think all courts recognize, all parties recognize, that there is wide discretion, there are certain things that a DA must do, and this is one of those laws that he must follow.
I mean, you're claiming that it should be a case-by-case basis, right, and not necessarily a blanket policy. But Gascon is saying there is discretion with the deputy DAs. Is that not true?
Well, so yes, there is discretion in how to handle the strike once it's filed, but there is no discretion in terms of filing it. Look, we live in a liberal democracy, and anyone who cares and cherishes that idea of a liberal democracy should respect and understand that we have different institutions that play different roles within our system. The legislature creates the laws, the judiciary interprets the laws. The legislature and the people created a law that says that prosecutors are limited in their discretion in terms of filing three strikes. The courts have interpreted that law as being constitutional, and the executive doesn't have a right to overturn two branches of government simply because he does not like the policy. I mean, anyone really who cares about liberal democracy, even if it's on such a local level, should be concerned about one man deciding public policy in such a insular and non-discretionary fashion.
I mean, isn't George Gascon beholden to the people who elected him? I mean, you guys are career employees of the department. You're not elected. George Gascon is. And so I would imagine the voters who put him there, and he campaigned on these reforms, by the way, want him to implement these kinds of reforms. How do you jibe those two things?
Well, so we're not really contesting the issue of his reforms. He wrote over 60 pages of directives. Our lawsuit probably aims at 2 pages of those directives. So we're not contesting his ability to implement reforms that he was elected upon. That's not the issue. The issue is there's also the rule of law. And one of the reasons why we have civil service protection as prosecutors is to make sure that we don't function as a political office, that we function purely as a public prosecutor, a political office. The law that he wants to ignore is a law that was passed by the people of the state of California on multiple occasions. All the voters, and by the way, 70% of California voters voted for three strikes. The voters also chose to have those types of policies as well. Mr. Gascon, is the elected DA. His support was in the lower 50s. But just because one person is elected and one election occurs doesn't mean we throw out all the law that currently exists, all the all the decisional authority that was done by the courts just because of one election. I mean, that's kind of the antithesis of what it means to live in a small L liberal democracy.
Can we talk about the three strikes law for just a minute? Because Gascon actually points out that those tough on crime policies, including the three strikes law, have resulted in huge increases in the number of people in California prisons. Voters have supported reforming those policies with the election of Gascon, but as you mentioned, voters did support the three strikes law as well. I mean, what do you say to that in that, we do have an issue with so many people behind bars? California had obviously a consent decree, right? To relieve the overcrowding in prisons. So what do you say to that?
Well, two things. First of all, in terms of California prison population, the population has actually dramatically decreased over the past decade.
Well, that was court ordered, though, correct?
That was partially court ordered. It was also because we implemented other reforms like Prop 57. So the prison population has actually decreased markedly since pretty much for the past decade. But the other issue is more important, I think, is that if he wants to change three strikes, if he wants to get rid of it, there's the initiative process, and he should have an initiative put on the ballot and change the law according to what he wants the law to be. But you don't get to change the law just because you were elected DA. That's what the legislature is. That's what the voters are for. Your job as the elected DA, and again, this is basic civics, is there to execute the law, not to create it. And so if Mr. Gascon doesn't like the policies that the voters implemented, then he should change the law like everyone else has to do.
You mentioned that you only took issue with a couple of pages of the many pages of reforms that Mr. Gascon came out with right after he was elected and sworn in. What are some of the reforms that you guys like?
I mean, this lawsuit is not about whether we like a reform or dislike a reform. This lawsuit is really about whether he has the power to do what he is asking his deputies to do, and whether he is putting his deputies in a position where they have to either follow his directives or follow the law. You know, contrary to what Mr. Gascon has stated publicly, and I think this was in an article in the LA Times, we don't swear a loyalty oath to him to implement what he wants. We swear an oath to the Constitution, to the state and federal Constitution, and we swear an oath to uphold the law. So what we're asking this court to do is make a determination. What do we have to do? Do we have to follow his directives, or do we have to follow the law as it is stated?
Gascon says he's not going to change course. I suspect if a lawsuit or a judge or a jury tells him you have to change course, he will change course. But what are your plans for continuing to work in the DA's office with him and for him? I mean, do you have a sense of how you're going to work together going forward if there's this contention going into it? We're not even 2 months into his administration at the DA's office.
The contention again is on a narrow set of his directives. There are many other areas I think that everyone could collaborate on, and we can listen to each other and find a better road. But really, this lawsuit is about certain issues where the law says he does not have discretion. We're asking the court to weigh in because he is exercising discretion where he is not legally permitted to exercise discretion.
Eric Siddall, the vice president of the union representing LA's deputy district attorneys. Mr. Siddall, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time.